They gave the program a name that translated, roughly, as the refining of imperfect matter. I learned that in the interrogation suite aboard the ERS Valdrin's Reach, 22 hours before the Iron Accord crossed into Ventari space. The suite was a repurposed cargo hold 2 decks below the bridge, steel-walled, cold, lit by a strip of fluorescence bolted to a ceiling that sat about 1.5 meters above my head. The Ventari delegate sat across a folding table from me, secured at the wrist to a ring welded into the tabletop. His name was Curator Dresh Ovas. He had chosen the word curator himself in standard when he introduced his title to the panel at Farpoint Station. He felt the word was accurate. He was correct. My name is Sela Marin. I was 26 years old when a Ventari collection team came to the fringe settlement on Karis Spur, and I was 31 when the escape pod I had pulled from a decommissioned compact shuttle put me across the border. Those 5 years are the reason I am the one writing this account. I am not a soldier, not an analyst, not a commander or a diplomat. I am a witness designate, appointed by the Unified Response Council 3 days after I completed my initial debriefing, and my function aboard the Valdrin's Reach was to be present for every operational confirmation, to ask whatever questions the Council needed asked of whatever compact personnel we had in custody, and to compile at the end the permanent record of the Iron Accord's operation. 410 warships, 14 installations, 11 days. I was present for all of it. I will begin with what was done, because the debt requires that it be stated plainly before anything else is entered into this record. The Ventari Compact is a caste civilization. I do not use that term loosely or as a rhetorical convenience. Every function of their society, from food allocation to the hierarchy of military rank to the nomming of ships, is determined by biological caste, a designation assigned at birth by a specialist called a classifier, based on an assessment of what the compact calls structural fitness. The highest caste is the artificers, and the artificers have, for at least 4 centuries by their own historical record, held that all biological matter falling short of what they consider the correct configuration can and should be refined. This is not a dissident philosophy. It is taught in their academies. It is encoded in the preamble of their founding charter. The compact does not view it as cruelty. They view it as maintenance, the responsible stewardship of biological material that exists, in their understanding of the universe, on a gradient from inferior to superior, and which has a moral obligation in their framework to aspire toward the superior. Humans made first contact with the compact 41 years ago. The contact parties on both sides assessed each other at the opening meeting, as contact parties do, and a classifier team accompanying the compact delegation assessed our representatives and logged us in the compact's registry as Category 6 matter functional, mobile, apparently intelligent in a limited sense, but architecturally incoherent, with significant potential for study. The word they used for study in standard translates best as developmental curiosity. The contact was recorded as cordial on both sides. Trade negotiations opened. A joint scientific exchange program was discussed over the following years. Nothing came of the exchange program. 9 years after first contact, the compact initiated what it called the Vantral Protocol. The Vantral Protocol was not announced. It was not disclosed to any human diplomatic body. It was not mentioned in the trade negotiation records or the exchange program correspondence or any document in the compact's official communication with us. It ran for 31 years before anyone on our side had any clear understanding of what it was. This is the first thing I want the record to reflect. For 31 years, the compact conducted this program while simultaneously maintaining cordial trade relations with us, attending diplomatic functions, sending academic delegations to joint conferences. The protocol and the diplomacy existed in the same span of time, run by the same civilization, and the people who managed the diplomacy knew about the protocol. That is not a historical footnote. That is the full picture. The protocol worked as follows. Compact collection teams, operating under diplomatic cover, or in unmarked vessels flying navigation codes registered to civilian freight companies, identified human settlements on fringe worlds and transit stations, places where disappearances would be slow to generate a centralized inquiry, where the ordinary mortality of frontier life provided cover, where the administrative records of a settlement could absorb a gap and attribute it to accident or departure or any of the 100 reasons a person stops appearing in a roster without anyone having to decide whether to investigate. The team selected individuals on the basis of what the compact classified as high-variance biological architecture, a designation that, as far as I was ever able to determine from the program's own records, amounted to whatever configuration a particular research team happened to find interesting in a given quarter. There was no single criterion. The compact's artificers had broad latitude to define what counted as interesting. They used it. Collection operations targeted groups of 3 to 41 individuals, never large enough to constitute what any frontier colony administrator would classify as a coordinated abduction, requiring immediate escalation to the central authority, always from places where the records were imprecise enough to make a gap look like a coincidence. The teams were methodical. They had protocols for every stage of the process, from initial reconnaissance to extraction to transport. The Compact's archive, which we obtained in full, contains the operational logs for every collection operation over 31 years. I read them all. I read them during the 8-week staging period at Farpon Assembly Yard, sitting at the secondary display in the forward observation corridor of the Valdrin's Reach, reading collection logs, while through the wide viewports I watched the Iron Accord's fleet fill the space outside. Over 31 years, 6,217 humans were taken. They were transported to one of 14 research installations distributed across Ventari space, 9 orbital stations, 4 planetary surface facilities, 1 deep space platform at a gravitational null point the compact used for containment protocols. Each subject was logged in the program's central archive under a catalog number and a physical classification record, processed through an intake assessment, and assigned to a research cohort led by an artificer of at least second-tier classification. The program's stated scientific purpose was to determine whether Category 6 matter, human beings, could be refined toward a higher structural classification through directed biological intervention. The unstated purpose, which emerges clearly from the program's internal communications and the private notes of its senior researchers, is somewhat more specific. The Compact's artificer caste had become intensely interested in human neural architecture, the way human neural systems process pain, memory, identity, the relationship between physical experience and psychological continuity. All of this was, in the Compact's assessment, anomalous. No other species in their registry displayed anything like it. They wanted to understand it. The way they chose to understand it was to take it apart and see what happened when they put it back together differently. The procedures were what the Compact's archive calls structural integration trials. What those words mean, when you read the procedural records and the post-operative notes and the mortality logs, is surgical grafting on a scale, and of a nature that I will describe as precisely as I can manage without this record becoming something that damages the people who read it. Human subjects were operated on, sometimes sedated, sometimes not, depending on whether the research cohort's protocol called for observation of conscious response, and human tissue, neural material, and in some cases intact segments of living human bodies were surgically joined with Ventari biological material, with synthetic constructs developed in the Compact's xenobiological labs, and in the integration trials with tissue or neural material harvested from other human subjects. The post-operative subjects were then monitored, in some cases for months, for the effects of the integrations on cognition, memory, pain response, identity continuity, and what the artificers called structural coherence under modification stress, which is a phrase that, when you translate it out of the compact's clinical vocabulary, means, how much can you change someone before they stop being the person they were? Most of the subjects died during the procedures. The compact's own survival rate data, which was meticulously recorded and is included in the permanent record in full, shows that fewer than 1 in 6 subjects survived their first procedure. Of those who survived, the majority were entered into subsequent trials and died during those. A small number, the protocol's records list 241 individuals, designated in the archive as stable outcomes, survived multiple procedures and were kept alive for ongoing observation and additional study. They were not released. They were not communicated with through official channels. When the compact decommissioned the Vantral Protocol in its final year of operation, not because of any ethical reconsideration, but because the artificer caste determined that the program had produced sufficient data, that the research questions had been answered to a satisfactory degree. The stable outcomes were cataloged, their observation records archived, and the installations repurposed to other research functions. I was not a stable outcome in the sense the compact intended. I was taken in the 3rd year of the protocol, processed through installation 7 on a moon the compact called Vantral Tertius, and I survived my initial procedure, a neural mapping process that left me with permanent partial hearing loss in my left ear and a scar along my jaw that I am looking at in the dark reflection of the screen at the far end of the cargo hold table as I write this. I survived subsequent procedures. I survived 11 months of observation. I survived because I am, apparently, the kind of person who watches and waits and does not stop watching even when she wants very much to stop, and eventually I saw what I needed to see. I found the decommissioned shuttle. I took the escape pod. I made it across the border. I do not tell you this so that you feel something about me. I tell you because you should understand who is writing the permanent record, and why the council felt it was appropriate that the witness designate be someone who had been in those rooms. Someone who had been in those rooms should be in the room when the answer came. That is the only logic I required, and it is the logic I believe is correct. The session with Dresh Ovas lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. He was in custody because our intelligence services had identified him as the administrative director of the Vantral Protocol for its final 9 years. Not a researcher, not an artificer of the scientific tier, but the man who had signed the budget authorizations, coordinated the communication logs between installations, reviewed the quarterly mortality reports, and approved the expansion of the integration trial program in its 25th year. He had been collected from a transit station in the border region 3 weeks before the Iron Accord departed Farpant, by a team whose methods I was not briefed on and did not ask about. He had been transferred to the Valdrin's Reach without incident. He was cooperative. That is the word that most accurately describes his conduct during the 4 hours and 20 minutes of that session. He was cooperative with the same naturalness that a competent administrator is cooperative when invited to discuss a project he managed well. He had records in his head, figures, dates, installation codes, research output citations. When I asked him to describe the quarterly mortality reporting process, he described it in detail, including the formatting conventions, the review timeline, the escalation protocol for quarters with mortality figures that deviated significantly from the running average. He was precise. He did not hedge or qualify or refuse. He answered every question I put to him, as though answering questions about the Vantral Protocol was an entirely ordinary professional obligation, which, from his perspective, it was. The council had given me a list of 12 questions to put to Ovas. I asked all 12 and then I asked follow-up questions on 6 of them, and at no point during those 4 hours and 20 minutes did Ovas express anything that I could identify as distress, discomfort, regret, or awareness that his answers were being given in the cargo hold of a warship 22 hours from crossing into Ventari space. He answered as if we were colleagues in an office somewhere, working through a shared project file. Curator Dreshovas asked me, near the end of our session, whether I had been a subject of the Vantral Protocol. He phrased the question carefully, in that studied standard he had prepared, and he asked it not as a taunt or a provocation, but as what appeared to be a genuine administrative inquiry. He seemed to be wondering whether my file was somewhere in the archive he had helped administer for 9 years. I told him yes. He nodded once, unhurried, and then he told me that Installation 7 had produced some of the program's most significant results in neuroplasticity research. He said the data from Installation 7's trials had contributed to 3 publications in the Compact's Journal of Structural Biology, 2 of which had received citation awards in the Compact's academic calendar. He said this the way a person describes a project they have tended carefully and take genuine satisfaction in. He was proud. There was no performance to it, no attempt to cause distress. He was simply proud of the work. I wrote his answer down in my notepad, the physical notepad I keep, not the terminal, because I find that certain things need to be written by hand to feel fully recorded. Then I closed the session, thanked the guard outside the hold, and went forward to the observation corridor to watch the transit gate approach. That is Dreshovas. That is the Ventari Compact. Now let me tell you how the Iron Accord came together. My escape pod crossed the border on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I was in a debriefing suite at Farpont Station, with 3 council intelligence officers and a medical team who kept checking my vitals as if they expected the numbers to change between checks. I spent 11 days in debriefing. The intelligence officers were thorough. They asked good questions. They did not push past what I could manage on a given day, and when I indicated that I had said as much as I could say about a particular subject, they moved to another subject and came back later. I remember those 11 days as the first time since my escape that I felt I was being treated as someone who had information rather than someone who had been damaged. Both were true. But the information mattered most to me at that point, because the information was the only path toward what needed to happen. On the Monday following my debriefing, the council convened its first closed session. I was not present for that session, but I was told afterward that the session had been called to receive the intelligence officer's preliminary assessment of my account and to decide whether to pursue an official inquiry. The council decided to pursue an inquiry. It took them 40 minutes. Over the following 19 days, I participated in 7 council sessions in the capacity of a primary source. I want to describe those sessions because they are part of the permanent record and because I think the nature of the deliberation matters as much as its outcome. The sessions were not heated. I had, in the months of my transit and my testimony, constructed a picture in my mind of how the council would respond when it understood the full scope of the Vantral Protocol, and in that picture, there were raised voices and fists on tables and people who needed to be talked down from positions of emotion. There were none of those things. The rooms were quiet. The delegates sat with their documents and asked questions, and listened to the answers with the particular stillness of people who are not surprised by what they are hearing, because they have already done the work of understanding it before they came to the table. They asked me precise questions. When did the collection begin? How were subjects selected? What were the medical facilities like? How many procedures had I personally undergone? What were the conditions of transport? What had I seen of other subjects? What was the nature of the stable outcomes designation, and what happened to those individuals after the program wound down? I answered everything I could answer. When I could not answer a question from my own experience, I said so and told them where they might look in the archive. The archive at that point was being processed by a team of analysts who had been working on it since 48 hours after my border crossing. The full Vantral Protocol archive, operational records, procedural logs, subject catalogs, staff files, budget records, internal communications, mortality data, the published papers and their citation records, had been obtained by our intelligence services through a channel I am not authorized to describe, and by the time I reached my seventh council session, the analysts had processed enough of it to provide preliminary figures. 31 years, 14 installations, 6,217 subjects, fewer than 1 in 6 surviving initial procedures, 241 stable outcomes, 46 published papers using protocol data, prize citations, staff promotion records showing career advancement attributable to the program's research output. On the 19th day, the Council voted on the Iron Accord. The resolution authorized a military response to the Vantral Protocol as a crime against humanity, designated the Ventari Compact's 14 research installations as lawful military targets under the terms of the resolution, and committed 410 warships of the Unified Response Force to the operation. The vote was unanimous. No delegate abstained. The closing session ran under 40 minutes. I was told afterward that the resolution's justification section was its shortest element. It was one sentence. The record speaks for itself. The next 8 weeks I spent at Farpont Assembly Yard, where the Iron Accord's fleet was staging. My witness-designate appointment came 6 days after the vote, along with a bunk assignment, a clearance level, and a 3-minute conversation with Commander Adrav Velan, who commanded the Valdrin's Reach and served as the Iron Accord's operational director. Velan was 63, a compact woman with close-cropped gray hair and the habit, when she was thinking, of standing with both hands clasped behind her back and her weight slightly forward on her feet, a posture that in a larger person might have seemed aggressive, but in her simply conveyed a quality of applied attention, as though the problem she was working on deserved her full physical engagement. She had commanded fleet operations in 3 previous engagements. She had not, as far as I could determine, raised her voice in a professional context in the last decade. She told me my role in 4 sentences. I would be present for every operational confirmation. I would have access to all after-action communications. I would compile the permanent record, including both the operational log and the complete catalog of the protocol's named victims, and I would transmit that record to the Council on completion of the operation, at which point my designation would expire. Then she asked if I had questions. I had several. She answered all of them without impatience or qualification, and when I was out of questions, she dismissed me to my bunk and returned to her work. I asked her, in that conversation, one question that was not on my prepared list. I asked her whether she had read the Vantral Protocol archive before accepting the operational command. She said she had read the full archive in 6 days, working through it between her other operational preparations. I asked her what she had concluded from it. She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer, but the quiet of someone selecting the exact right words from several options. Then she said, "I concluded that the Council's resolution was correctly worded. The record speaks for itself." Then she told me to get some sleep, and she went back to her display. I spent time at the forward observation corridor viewports every day during the staging period. The corridor ran the full length of the ship's upper hull, and the viewports looked out over the assembly yard's approach quadrant. And through them, I watched the Iron Accord's 410 ships take their positions over the 8 weeks of staging, arriving in groups, different classes from different yards, settling into the formation the tactical plan had assigned them. The heavy cruisers of the Velan group came in the first week, then the destroyer escorts of the 8th Meridian Wing, then the strike carriers in the 2nd and 3rd weeks, then the support vessels and the fleet tenders and the specialized intelligence ships whose function in the operation I was not briefed on, but which I understood involved the archive's data and the target confirmations. I spent time at those viewports every day during the staging period, more time than was strictly necessary. I was doing most of my work, the catalog, the archive review, the briefing dossiers, at the secondary display in the observation corridor, so I was there frequently, and the viewport was a natural place to rest your eyes when the text on the screen became too much. But I also stood at the viewports when I did not need to rest my eyes. I stood there and watched the ships. I had spent 5 years looking at Ventari vessels from the interior of Ventari vessels. Looking at human ships from the inside of a human ship was a fact I was still in the process of becoming accustomed to. It is a specific kind of adjustment, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that announces itself. More like the slow calibration of a balance that has been out of true for a long time and is returning carefully to level. Every time a new group of iron accord ships crossed into the assembly zone and settled into formation, I felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but occupied the same neighborhood as both. The fleet was not uniform, which I found I appreciated. 410 ships from multiple production runs across multiple yards, hull shapes ranging from the wedge-profile dreadnoughts of the Velan group to the lower, broader silhouette of the Meridian destroyers to the cathedral-like vertical architecture of the strike carriers. They had different engine signatures, different weapons configurations, different crew complements. What unified them was function and authorization. They were here because the council had said to come. They were going where the council had directed. They would do what the council had authorized. The organization was total and the purpose was singular, and the decision had already been made by the people whose job it was to make it, which meant that the fleet's only remaining task was execution. I found the simplicity of that, at that point in my life, more comforting than I would have expected. I thought a great deal during those 8 weeks about the ratio. The compact had operated 14 installations for 31 years, 9,000 staff, approximately, across all sites, to run a program that processed 6,217 human beings, 410 warships to answer it. I know the word that gets used for that ratio. I have used the word myself in the months after my escape, in the early weeks when I was still trying to determine what I felt about what needed to happen. I am not using the word anymore. The compact called their program the refining of imperfect matter. They believed that what they were doing was a form of improvement, that the subjects of the Vantral Protocol were, in some sense, the beneficiaries of the program, being brought closer to structural correctness through the process of being unmade and remade. The compact did not view the size of the program as disproportionate to its objective. They viewed it as appropriately scaled. 410 warships to address 14 installations is the Iron Accord's own assessment of appropriate scale, arrived at by people with the authority and the information to make that assessment. And I will say nothing further about the ratio, except that the message was the size, and the size was the message. And the Ventari Compact had 31 years to understand what happens when you make the kind of choices they made, and now they understand. Commander Velan addressed the fleet captains 2 days before departure on the ship-wide comm. I was in the observation corridor when she spoke. The address was 4 minutes and 12 seconds long. She described the operational parameters, the target sequencing, the communication protocols during the operation, the rules of engagement. She did not describe the Vantral Protocol. She did not name the victims or invoke the moral weight of the offense, or use any language that belonged to the register of justice or vengeance or wrath. She spoke in the register of an operational briefing, which is a register I had come to find, by then, deeply appropriate to this situation. The wrath and the justice and the moral weight were in the archive and in the catalog and in the permanent record. The fleet's job was execution. She said, 14 installations, 11 days. We execute this operation with the same precision the compact applied to its own work, and we come home. That was the last thing she said before closing the channel. She is the best commander I have observed in any context. I want that in the record. We crossed into Ventari space on a morning I remember clearly. The quality of the light through the forward observation corridor shifted when we came through the transit gate, a subtle change. The kind of thing you might not notice if you were not paying attention, but I was paying attention. The amber glow of the local colonial sun came in at a slightly different angle than the light at Farpant. The star field through the viewports had a different configuration. Ventari space looked mostly like space. Stars. a planet visible at extreme range, rust brown with ice rings, which the tactical charts labeled Ventral Secundus. Not our first target. Our first target was Installation 1, in fixed orbital position above a moon called Ventral Keth, 14 hours transit from the gate. I went to the bridge for the transit. Velen had not invited me, but my clearance permitted access and she had not restricted it. So I went and positioned myself at the secondary display bank in the rear section where I could see the tactical screens and the sensor readouts without being in anyone's way. I watched the 14 hours pass on the tactical clock. The bridge ran its normal watch rotation during the transit. Officers came and went at their stations. Velen stood for most of it, hands behind her back, occasionally stepping to a display to review something and then stepping back. The atmosphere on the bridge was what I can only describe as purposeful calm, not the heightened alertness of people bracing for combat, but the focused, settled quality of people who have done the preparation and now have only to execute. Installation 1 appeared on the long-range sensors at hour 11, a small gray signature that the tactical computer resolved over the following 3 hours into a more detailed profile. Large-format biological research station in fixed orbit, approximately 4 kilometers in diameter. Power signature consistent with an active research facility at standard operations. No significant weapons systems detected. Docking configurations matching the intelligence dossier's description. The dossier for Installation 1 was the one I knew best, because I had read it first and most carefully, as the oldest of the 14 facilities. It had been operational for 27 of the protocol's 31 years. The intelligence assessment put its peak staff complement between 800 and 1,200. The compact's own protocol records showed that Installation 1 had received 612 subjects over its operational history. Of those 612, 91 had survived initial procedures. Of those 91, 22 had been classified as stable outcomes and retained. I thought about the 22 stable outcomes from Installation 1 during those final 3 hours of approach. 22 people who had survived enough of what Installation 1's artificers put them through to be worth keeping. 22 people who were, by the time the protocol wound down, somewhere in the compact's observation infrastructure, cataloged and monitored, and not going anywhere. The intelligence data gave no accounting of what had become of them after the protocol's close. I had noted this gap in my review of the dossier and flagged it for the Council's attention. It was one of the questions that remained open when the Iron Accord departed Farpent, and it is one of the questions that remains open now that I am writing this record. I do not know what happened to the 241 stable outcomes, beyond the ones like me who escaped. That uncertainty is in the permanent record as an open item. It is not something the Iron Accord's 11 days resolved. It is, perhaps, the work that comes after the record is complete. At hour 14, Commander Velen looked at the sensor readout and then looked up at the communications officer and said, without preamble, "All weapons to operational status. Target confirmed as Installation 1, Ventral Keth orbit. Fire when ready." The weapons officer said confirmed, and the discharge took 11 seconds. The gray circle on the sensor screen became a debris field. The installation's power signature dropped to 0, and the field spread slowly in the orbital plane in a pattern that the sensor display rendered as a faint radial bloom, spreading, thinning, settling into the orbital track. The moon's surface, 400 kilometers below, was too distant for any debris to reach at meaningful velocity. Velen looked at the sensor display for a moment. "Log Installation 1, she said. "Time of completion. Sensor confirmed. Pass to the witness designate." The communications officer passed the confirmation to my secondary display. I logged it. Time, coordinates, method, duration of weapons discharge, sensor confirmed result. Then beneath the operational data, I wrote the installation's designation in the compact's own records, its years of operation, its staff complement, and the number of Ventral protocol subjects processed there, 612. I noted the survival figures. I noted the stable outcome count. Then I opened the subject catalog, the document I had been building since the staging period, and I transferred the 612 names from installation 1's subject records into the main catalog. 612 entries, confirmed names where the archive had them, catalog numbers and physical classification data where it did not. We moved to installation 2. The 11 days had a texture that I want to describe accurately, because I think the texture matters for anyone trying to understand what the Iron Accord's operation was. People who were not there may imagine it as something that felt like momentum building toward a crescendo, escalating, charged, emotionally heightened in the way that accounts of military engagements tend to be written. It was not like that. Each installation was approached, assessed, confirmed against the intelligence data, and addressed. Each confirmation was logged. Between installations, we were in transit, and during transit the ship ran its standard watch rotations, and the crew maintained the rhythms of a ship underway, and I sat at the secondary display and worked on the catalog. The catalog was the most consuming part of my work. The Compact's archive contained a catalog number and a processing record for each of the 6,217 subjects. Some records also contained a name, as recorded by the collection team's intake process. Many did not. The Compact had not bothered with names in many cases, recording instead the catalog number and the physical classification assessment. For those subjects, I worked from the missing persons databases compiled by the fringe colony administrations over the 31 years of the protocol, cross-referencing the Compact's collection dates and collection locations against the records of individuals who had stopped appearing in settlement rosters during those periods. It was painstaking work. The colony databases were imprecise in many cases, the record-keeping of frontier settlements being what it is, and the cross-referencing required judgment calls that I documented carefully in the catalog's methodology notes. By the 4th day, I had confirmed 5,911 of the 6,217. By the 8th day, I had reached 6,142. The remaining 75 I could not confirm by name through any source available to me. They remained in the catalog under their Compact catalog numbers, VT designations, installation codes, intake dates. I included all of them. I documented my inability to confirm a name, and I included every piece of identifying information the Compact's archive contained for them, and I listed them in the catalog the same way I listed everyone else. A catalog number is a record. A record is a name, in any ledger that is being kept in good faith. On the 6th day, we were in transit between installations, and I had, for the first time since departing Farpoint, 6 consecutive hours with no scheduled operational events and no catalog entries requiring immediate attention. I spent part of those hours in the observation corridor, and part of them in the ship's mess eating a meal that I do not remember except that it was hot, and part of them trying to sleep in my bunk without particular success. I had not been sleeping well since we crossed into Ventari space. This is not something I would ordinarily include in a record of this kind. But I am including it because I committed at the outset to accuracy, and the accuracy of a witness designates account includes the condition of the witness. What kept me from sleeping was not what I would have expected. I had anticipated that the operation would produce nightmares, that being in Ventari space again, working through the archive every day, watching the installation confirmations come through, would push my mind back into the specific architecture of Installation 7, the rooms, the procedures, the particular quality of silence that the facility had maintained during the observation periods. That did not happen. What happened was simpler. I would lie on my bunk in the dark and I would count. Not the 6,217, I had those numbers memorized. I carried them with me. They were not what I was counting. I was counting something harder to name. I was counting up the years between when the first collection operation ran and when the escape pod I was sitting in crossed the border, and I was counting the names I had confirmed that day against the names remaining, and I was counting the installations addressed against the installations remaining, and all of the counting was precise and correct, and it kept me awake because the numbers, when they were precise and correct, left no room for anything else, which was the point of them. On the 8th day, I addressed a question that had been in my notes since the 2nd day. What had the Compact's trade delegation known, and when? The archive contained the full record of the Compact's diplomatic communications with our council, running concurrent with the Vantral Protocol's 31 years. I pulled those records and cross-referenced them with the protocol's operational logs. The result was a document I included in the permanent record as Appendix 7, a side-by-side timeline of the protocol's collection operations and the diplomatic correspondence running in parallel. The timeline showed that in several instances, Compact diplomatic representatives had met with our council delegates on the same day that protocol collection operations were running in the same star system. The diplomats and the collection teams were not the same people. But the timeline shows they worked for the same civilization, on the same day in the same region of space, and the civilization's leadership knew both activities were occurring. That is in the permanent record. I want it read. On the 9th day, we addressed Installation 11, which was the installation where I had been processed. The intelligence dossier flagged it as the largest of the 14 by physical footprint and staff complement, and also as the site of the program's most extensive multi-subject integration trials. Procedures in which 2 or more subjects were operated on simultaneously with the explicit goal of producing a functioning biological integration between them. Neural connections, shared circulatory elements, tissue unions intended to produce what the Compact's artificers described as a unified structural entity from disparate source matter. The trials had run over 8 years at Installation 4. The lead researcher had produced a monograph. The monograph had been cited in 11 subsequent Compact publications. I thought about the monograph while I logged Installation 4. I thought about the 11 citations. I thought about the academic career that had been built on the work done in that station, and about all the academic careers at all 14 installations, and about the prize nominations I had read in the dossiers. The Compact had built an entire intellectual infrastructure on top of what it had done. Papers, citations, conferences, promotions. The work was real to them in the way that legitimate scientific inquiry is real. It had the full apparatus of institutional recognition wrapped around it. That, I think, is the thing about the Compact that is hardest to convey to someone who has not read the archive. They were not conducting the Vantral Protocol despite their civilization's values. They were conducting it because of them. The program was a full expression of what the Compact believed about biological matter, and who had the right to work with it, and toward what ends. On the 5th day, a Ventari Compact military vessel entered sensor range. A patrol frigate single ship, running a standard circuit through the outer system. It received our fleet's transponder signal and held its position for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I timed it from the secondary display, and then it altered course and departed at full drive. It transmitted nothing. It did not challenge our presence on any channel. I logged the contact. Velan watched the sensor track until it faded and then returned to the tactical display. I thought, watching her, that the frigate's crew had done exactly what I would have done in their position. They had seen 410 ships. They had done the arithmetic. They had left. I had some professional sympathy for the crew of that frigate. On the 7th day, a signal came in on a civilian diplomatic frequency, the kind of channel used for commercial arbitration, addressed to Commander Velan. She listened to it through her earpiece, and then she handed the earpiece to me without comment. The signal was from a Ventari artificer of the 2nd tier, who identified himself as a representative of the Compact Science Directorate. He spoke careful standard, the kind of careful that comes from preparation rather than fluency. He said that the Compact wished to express serious concern regarding the Iron Accord's actions within Ventari sovereign space. He said the Vantral Protocol had been a legally authorized scientific program conducted under the Compact's domestic research charter, that subjects had been acquired in accordance with established Compact classification protocols, and that the destruction of legitimate scientific infrastructure constituted unjustified aggression for which the Compact reserved the right to seek redress through galactic arbitration mechanisms. He expressed hope that Commander Velen would consider a pause in operations to allow for dialogue. Then he said, and I want this stated in the permanent record verbatim, that while the Compact recognized the subjects of the Vantral Protocol as human beings, it wished to note that the program's procedures had advanced biological science in ways that had benefited multiple civilizations, and that this benefit represented a form of compensatory value the Council might wish to consider in its assessment of the situation. I handed the earpiece back to the communications officer. Velen said, "No response, log the contact." I logged it. We continued. On the 9th day, we addressed Installation 11. I had known, since reading the dossiers in the staging period, that Installation 11 was where I had been processed. I had known that the 9th day would be different in some way I could not predict. I stood at the secondary display on the bridge, and I watched the sensor screen, and I waited to feel something that departed from what I had felt on the 8 days before. I felt what I had felt on the 8 days before. I need to try to explain this accurately, because I think people who were not present may wonder about it. The grief that had sustained me through 5 years of captivity and 5 years of testimony and 8 weeks of staging and 8 days of operation had not, by the 9th day, any further to travel. It had already traveled as far as it could travel. It had become something else, not numbness, not absence, but a kind of settled weight that had incorporated itself into my posture and my breathing, and the way I held a pen, so thoroughly that it no longer announced itself as grief. It was simply the configuration I was in. The grief was the floor I was standing on, and I had been standing on it long enough that I no longer had to think about it to stay upright. I stood at the secondary display on the bridge of the Valdrin's Reach, and I watched Velen say execute, and I watched the sensor circle that was Installation 11 stop being a circle and become a slowly spreading field of fragments, and I logged it. Time, coordinates, method, duration, sensor confirmation, subjects processed 407, survival rate figures, stable outcome count, subjects transferred to the catalog 407. After I logged it, I went to the forward observation corridor. I wanted to see the debris field from one of the wide viewports, and I stood at the viewport and looked. The fragments were visible at our distance, irregular shapes, some of them still catching the light of the local sun, turning in the slow rotation of their own dispersal. I stood there for some time, not because I felt I needed to in order to process something, because it seemed correct that I do it. A witness should witness. Then I went back to the catalog. On the 10th day, we addressed Installations 12 and 13 in sequence. Installation 13 was the program's most recently constructed facility, built in the protocol's 25th year to accommodate an expansion of the integration trials, and also the installation where, according to the intelligence data, the program had experienced its only significant internal resistance. In the program's 28th year, 3 artificers assigned to Installation 13 had filed what the Compact's internal records termed a structural ethics inquiry regarding specific aspects of the multi-subject integration protocol. The inquiry had been reviewed by an administrative board and dismissed. The 3 artificers had been reassigned to non-research postings. The program had continued without modification. I included the ethics inquiry in the permanent record, the inquiry itself, the board's dismissal response, and the reassignment records. I flagged these documents in the methodology notes as particularly significant because what they show is specific and important. The Compact had not operated the Vantral Protocol in ignorance of the possibility that it required ethical examination. 3 of its own people had raised that question. The question had been examined by the appropriate institutional process, and the institutional process had determined that the work should continue. That is not ignorance. That is a considered decision, documented, made by people with the authority to make it and the information to understand what they were authorizing. I wanted that in the record with the same precision and completeness as everything else. On the 11th day, we addressed Installation 14. The dossier described it as the smallest of the 14 facilities by physical footprint, but noted that it had served as the program's administrative headquarters. The site of the central archive, the budget records, the communication logs between installations, the personnel files of the roughly 9,000 Ventari who had worked on the protocol across its 31 years. Most of the archive had been moved to off-site data storage in the program's final year, and those records had since come to us through the same channel that yielded the full protocol archive. But Installation 14, the administrative hub, the place where the program's directors had sat and read the mortality reports and signed expansion authorizations, and reviewed prize nomination materials, remained in fixed orbit above Vantral Prime, the compact's most densely populated colony world. We crossed into Vantral Prime's orbital space at 600 hours on the 11th day. The Iron Accord's fleet deployed in an observation arc above the orbital plane, 410 ships at full formation extension. Below us, Vantral Prime, rust and ochre and polar cloud cover, an inhabited world, millions of Ventari going about whatever it is millions of Ventari do on a given morning. I stood at the secondary display, and I thought about that consciously, because I believe it is important to think about it consciously and to write it down. 410 warships above a populated world is not a neutral fact. It is a statement about capability and about the relationship between capability and restraint. The Iron Accord's mandate covered 14 installations, 14 specific targets, identified by the Council, authorized by the vote, designated as lawful military targets on the basis of their role in the Vantral Protocol. Vantral Prime was not a target. The compact's civilian population was not a target. The restraint was not a failure of resolve. The restraint was the point. We were not the Ventari Compact. The Compact had operated the Vantral Protocol on the principle that it had the right to take human beings, without consent, without warrant, without acknowledgement, because its classification system determined that we were Category 6 matter subject to refinement. We were demonstrating a different principle, that what a civilization does to those it considers beneath it is answerable, specifically, by the people it considered beneath, and that the answer is exactly as large as it needs to be and not one installation larger. The Iron Accord addressed 14 installations. That is what we came to do. That is what we did. Commander Velen said, "Execute for the 14th time." 11 seconds. The sensor confirmation arrived at the secondary display. I logged it. Velen turned from the tactical display. The bridge was quiet in the way it had been quiet for 11 days, not tense, not relieved, not celebratory, purposeful. She looked across the room at me and said, "Witness designate, please confirm the operation is complete and the permanent record is ready to transmit." I opened the catalog on my display. 6,217 entries, 6,142 confirmed by name, 75 by compact catalog number. All 14 installation logs complete, time, coordinates, sensor confirmation, operational data, annotated protocol dossier. Full archive integrated. The 7th-day diplomatic signal logged. The ethics inquiry and its dismissal logged. The prize citations and publication records of the senior researchers logged. The personnel files of the compact staff who had worked on the program, insofar as the archive contained them, logged. I said, "Confirmed. The permanent record is complete." She said, "Transmit." I transmitted the permanent record to the Council. We left Ventari space. The transit to the gate took 16 hours. The Iron Accord in the same formation it had held for 11 days, and I stood in the forward observation corridor for part of that transit, and watched the space through the wide viewports, and then went to my bunk and slept. 3 hours from the gate, a transmission arrived on the same civilian diplomatic frequency that had carried the seventh-day signal. The communications officer brought it to me, correctly. The operation was complete. Any incoming transmissions to the fleet now came to the witness designate. The transmission was a single word in standard. The word was, "Why?" I do not know who sent it. The frequency carried only a general Vantral Prime origin tag. It could have been the Science Directorate representative from the seventh day, or a compact government official, or a private citizen at a personal comm terminal on the planet we had just left. I made no attempt to determine the source, and I recorded no speculation about it in the permanent record. The question was the same regardless of who had composed it. I spent the 3 remaining hours of transit thinking about whether to answer it. I composed answers in my head. I thought about citing the Council's resolution, the one-sentence justification paragraph. I thought about nomming the installations, the 11 days, the 410 ships, and what the number meant. I thought about nomming myself, Sela Marin, taken from Kara Spur, subject catalog number VT41187 in the Compact's own archive, a piece of Category 6 matter that had turned out to be harder to conclude than the Installation 7 team had anticipated. I did not send any of those answers. The permanent record had been transmitted before the word "why" arrived. That meant the answer had preceded the question by several hours. 6,217 names, 14 installations, 31 years documented in full, the Compact's own records turned into the complete account of what they had done and to whom. Every answer that needed to be given was in that record, and I had transmitted it before anyone on the Compact's side had found the composure to ask why. And I found that the order of events, the answer, then the question, was not an accident but a fact about the situation that I wanted in the permanent record as well. I logged the transmission. Origin Vantral Prime. Content 1 word. No response sent by the Iron Accord. That was the last entry in the operational log. We crossed through the gate. The light changed. I completed the final version of the permanent record during the transit back to Farpoint. Final log entries. Operational summary, methodology notes. The catalog verified one last time. 6,217. I had been one of them. The catalog listed me under my own name, Sela Marin, cross-reference to VT41187, listed among the confirmed survivors of the protocol, one of the 241 stable outcomes, one of an unknown smaller number who had made it out of Ventari space alive. I transmitted the completed record to the Council from my bunk, 2 days from Farpoint, and then I closed the terminal. The Valdrins reached docked at Farpoint Station on a Thursday. The Iron Accord's fleet dispersed to its home yards over the following 2 weeks. I have since been informed that the Ventari Compact has submitted a formal protest to the Galactic Arbitration Body on the grounds that the Iron Accord's operation constituted an unlawful military strike against civilian scientific infrastructure. The protest was acknowledged by the arbitration body and placed in the queue for consideration. I have not heard anything further about it, and I do not expect that I will hear anything that changes the substance of what has already been entered into the permanent record. The permanent record is archived. The Council has it. The 6,217 names are in it. I do not have a closing thought that improves on those numbers. The numbers are the answer. They were always the answer. The Compact spent 31 years counting its own data, survival rates, integration outcomes, citation records, prize nominations, the accumulated evidence of a productive research program conducted to the highest standards of Compact institutional practice. We counted the people they took. We counted them carefully and completely, and when we were done counting, we paid what was owed, and the size of the payment was not incidental to the message. The size was the message. It had to be large enough that no one, anywhere, looking at the permanent record afterward, would spend more than a moment wondering whether we had understood what had been done. We understood. The Iron Accord understood. The 14 installations addressed over 11 days understood, in the only way that 14 installations can understand something. The compact civilization, standing on a planet below 410 ships in formation, looked up and understood what we chose not to do, which is the other half of what the Iron Accord communicated. The debt is paid, the record is complete, there is nothing further to add to it. I have been asked, since returning to Farpent, whether I feel that the Iron Accord accomplished what it was meant to accomplish. I have been asked this by colleagues, by the council liaisons who received my final transmission, by the medical officer who reviewed my post-operational health assessment, and by a journalist who contacted me through the council's press office and whom I declined to speak to. I will answer the question here once in the permanent record, where it belongs. The Iron Accord was not designed to accomplish a feeling. It was designed to address 14 installations, and it addressed 14 installations. It was designed to compile a record of 6,217 names, and the record is compiled. It was designed to demonstrate, to the Ventari Compact, and to anyone else in a position to observe what happened, that the Compact's assessment of human beings as Category 6 matter subject to refinement without consent or consequence was an assessment that would be corrected. That correction has been made. Whether what I feel about it constitutes accomplishment is not a question the permanent record is equipped to answer, and I do not think it is a question that needs answering. The record stands without it. The record stands.